Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining this RTPI London webinar on climate resilience. I'm Katie Liddington. I'm an environmental planner. I'm a member of the RTPI Regional Management Board, and I'll be chairing the session today. I'm really excited to be bringing you a webinar on this subject. As I'm sure you're all aware, the RTPI has vowed to place addressing climate change at the heart of all of its activities, acknowledging that planning is key to achieving sustainable development. Today's webinar will discuss the considerations in planning for climate change, along with opportunities and challenges of embedding climate resilience into projects. As you can see, we've got three wonderful panelists joining me today, and the format will be that they'll each give a 15-minute presentation on their subject, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session at the end. There should be a chat function that you can see in the right-hand panel of your webinar. If you send in your questions via there, we'll try and get to as many as we can. There'll also be a few polls at the end of the presentations, so please keep an eye out for those and get involved. Okay, so I'd like to introduce to you our first speaker, Isabella Krabbe. Isabella recently joined the RTPI as a research officer with a focus on urban planning and climate change. She's got master's degrees in geography and urban and regional planning, and I think we'll all be interested to see what she has to say. So over to you, Isabella.
Hi everybody, thank you for joining and thanks for that introduction, Katie. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of touch on the spatial planning considerations in a broad sense and some of the research we've been doing here at the RTPI before we hand over to Chris and Nick, who are going to go more in depth about embedding climate resilience at the project level. So I always think with these things it's important to start with a definition of what is climate resilience. It might seem quite basic, but I think resilience is a term a bit like sustainability in that it's become this buzzword that's used over and over again. And I think it's important to take the time to go back to what the word actually means. So the IPCC has defined climate resilience as the ability of cities as ecological, social and economic systems to resist, recover from and continue to develop despite climate-related shocks. The term does include both adaptation, so responding to the effects of climate change, and also mitigation, which is more about reducing emissions. But I think the word highlights quite well the kind of complex and interconnected nature of cities and the need for a holistic approach in order to make cities more climate resilient. And effective spatial planning really is key over the long term, based on an understanding of how these changes are going to interact and affect people's health and well-being, and also be felt differently across communities. So these are just kind of some of the things that need to be considered in this holistic approach, and as I've said, spatial planning is very well placed to consider all of these different things in the round. These are just a few of the kind of key considerations that you would be thinking about in planning for climate resilient places. So you've got planning for green infrastructure, ensuring there's effective walking and cycling networks, thinking about, you know, the location of development. Is development close to a railway station? Is it mixed use? Integrating land use and infrastructure planning, ensuring that kind of new builds meet zero carbon energy standards, and also retrofitting existing buildings, which obviously is extremely important considering most of the houses that are on the planet at the moment have, you know, already been built. Planning for renewable and low carbon energy storage, sustainable water usage, so sustainable urban drainage, your more kind of climate adaptation measures such as planning for flooding and mitigating against overheating. And also the last one there I wanted to put in, it might seem like not really related to the above, but I think it's a really important consideration for spatial planning, is this idea of climate justice and being able to identify which groups are not only vulnerable to climate change, but are also socially and economically vulnerable. And that's something that I'm going to touch on a bit later in this presentation. I also came across this survey, which I wanted to share just when I was doing the research for what to put into the presentation. And I thought it was quite interesting in terms of what people want from their communities is quite well aligned with what would actually make a resilient community. So in 2014, the RTPI asked people what would be the top things that they want to see from their community. And the things that have come out on top are these sort of access to green spaces, walkability, diversity of community, local economy as well, so ensuring there's local jobs which would tie into, you know, mixed use development. And when thinking about cities and climate resilience, it is important to situate the challenges within the local context, as each city is going to face different challenges. I'm aware this webinar is London focused, so I've done an example from London, which as a big city would be particularly vulnerable to the urban heat island effect. And while national policy does contain well-established guidance on flood risk, it's less clear on other climate adaptation measures which limit overheating. So these are just a few of the kind of planning considerations you'd be thinking about when trying to limit the urban heat island effect. So for example, there's the design using materials which are going to reflect rather than absorb heat, and also which allow water to permeate through. So that photo at the bottom there is just some terracotta paving, which obviously is a more permeable surface than tarmac and allows the water to penetrate through and cool the surrounding environment. Thinking about deploying green infrastructure as well, that's the top photo there, like green walls and green roofs can reduce summer temperatures, and also reliance on mechanical cooling systems like air conditioning, which release further heat. And also, kind of from a spatial perspective, being able to monitor the cumulative impact that permitted development might have in an area on this overheating effect. And so, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I think really a key kind of contribution of planning in this sector is thinking about climate justice. And in planning for climate resilience, a key consideration does need to be where social and economic disadvantage combine with vulnerability to climate change. The current coronavirus pandemic is actually a very good example of this, highlighting that some communities are more vulnerable than others, both in susceptibility to the disease and also being able to respond to social distancing. And the same can really be said for climate impacts. For example, the elderly, children and those with underlying health conditions are most vulnerable to the effects of overheating. So it's important to ensure that appropriate measures are in place close to things like schools and care homes to limit that effect of overheating. And these ideas around climate justice have been further explored in this position paper that we published in November last year, kind of outlining the arguments for why this idea of climate justice is very important in spatial planning. So if anybody has a bit of extra time during this lockdown, then I would highly recommend giving that a read. And obviously, you know, when planning for climate resilience, having properly resourced planning departments is crucial, so planning can be proactive rather than reactive to this challenge. This graph here was taken from some research carried out by the RTPI in 2017. And it actually shows that between 2006 and 2016 that there has been a 14% decrease in resourcing for local planning authorities across England. And I wanted to finish off just with a comment on the key role of spatial planning and some lessons from the Liverpool City region. My predecessor, before I joined, spent quite a few months working with the Liverpool City region on their strategic development plan, and essentially found that combined authorities play a key role in tackling both local and cross-boundary issues in climate resilience through these strategic development plans. But the plans must have an evidence base which takes into account local and cross-boundary climate risks. and consider some forecasts for future scenarios and the possibility of, for example, increased temperatures, how that might affect vulnerability towards climate change. And again, having this sort of climate justice-based approach that takes account of the social and economic vulnerabilities that are going to be present in an area. We've got a full research paper which is going to be published on this in due course, so do look out for that. And if you are interested in planning and climate change, then please see some of the research and policy positions that we've published over the past couple of years. They range from planning for smart energy to planning for low carbon transport. And there's also a very useful guide in here, the Rising to the Climate Challenge, which discusses some of the areas that local authorities need to think about when planning for climate change. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabella. That was great. It's really encouraging to see what the RTPI are doing from a research perspective on climate change, especially around the vulnerability of people in a climate resilience world. I think that's something that I'd never really considered before, and I think it's really important. So thank you. I'm sure we've got lots of questions coming in on that. Okay, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Christopher Harris. I actually work with Chris, so I am delighted that he can join us on this panel. Christopher works as an Associate Director in Climate Resilience and Sustainability at Wood. He specialises in climate change mitigation, sustainability, climate change, adaptation, and the resilience of infrastructure systems. He leads climate change assessment services across a wide range of sectors, including urban planning, transport, and energy. So over to you, Chris.
Great, thank you, Katie. Can you see my screen? Is that right? Splendid, thank you very much, and thanks to the RTPI for inviting me to speak today. It's an absolute pleasure. Give me 1 second. Oh, need there to be something. Okay, right, there we go. Right, my name's Chris Harris from Wood PLC. I'm not a planner. I am a sort of climate change and environmental sustainability practitioner. That means I work across a lot of different scales and like crucially with our planners in Wood PLC. So perhaps some of the examples and some of the things I'm talking about might be beyond the role of a traditional sort of town planning role, but we're going to bring it sort of back down to that town planning level at the end. So I haven't got a definition. This is my non-definition. You won't find this in any textbooks or any protocols. This is something I came up with this morning in the kitchen. So this is kind of what it means to planners really in plain English. So we want to plan and build everything to be designed to be to have societal, environmental and economic value. By climate resilience, pretty basically we're just saying that we want that to continue into the future, so that benefit and value that you bring for something tomorrow is able to absorb and cope with those climate change impacts and still deliver that value into the future. All I'm going to do today is just quickly run through those drivers for climate resilience in the planning system, set out some challenges, and then a few solutions, some of the things that we're working on at Wood particularly, and I know that Nick in the next presentation is going to go into more depth in some of those solutions, and then some good practice from across the planning hierarchy. Right, so drivers, policy, first of all, policy and evidence. The policy in the UK is fantastic, really. The Climate Change Act came in 2008, as many of you will know, and it's been updated many times since. It enables us to understand and monitor the impacts of climate change and the way in which we're adapting to it. The evidence it provides us with through the Climate Change Risk Assessment, through UK Climate Change Projections 2018, are great tools, great ability for us to be able to quickly understand what the overall picture is in terms of the way that climate change is considered in the UK. Generally, in terms of the evidence, we're seeing the impacts today, and we're seeing how those projections are showing us where those impacts will be. Obviously, we know about the fact that there's often too much water in the wrong place. Sometimes there's not enough water in the right place. Isabella's talked there about heat risk. That's becoming more and more prevalent. We're not necessarily set up for the kind of temperatures that we're seeing and we're going to be seeing in the future, like some other countries have been. And then transition risk, decarbonising, that brings its own risk in terms of being resilient to future climate change. And then there's public perception and people. So it doesn't need me to tell you that there's been a huge upsurge in awareness and understanding around climate change. The young generation are kind of showing us how it's done in that regard. We're seeing environmental lawsuits brought against projects that are carbon intensive, and there's more and more of a need in the public discourse every day for energy transition. That's more and more about decarbonising, but what we're seeing is people are understanding that we're overshooting, what we can use as a society and as a planet, and that we need to adapt for the future. And then the last one is the resilience dividend, which is a kind of fancy title for ensuring that not only what we build is able to withstand that future climate, but it continues to deliver that social, economic, and environmental well-being for society. So residents, we're saving more lives, there's less health risks. There's lower operating risks and higher investment confidence for businesses and institutions, and governments are able to protect vulnerable people. So challenges, first of all, thanks to the RTPI for bringing up climate justice. I mean, this is a chart which is a few years old now that I really like. It was produced by Newcastle University. It sets out in orange there the level of adaptation in different areas in the country, and in green the mitigation, so the decarbonisation generally. What this shows is that for whatever reason, I said I'm not a planner, we see very, very different levels of adaptation preparedness across the country. So if you're in London, Manchester, places like Bristol, the policies are all in place. Everything's, things are streamlined. There's no excuse for not developing climate resilient systems, projects, towns, housing estates, whatever it may be. In other areas, you can see that that chart looks very, very different. The segment there for adaptation planning is non-existent in some of those areas. So from my point of view, working on projects and trying to build in design and engineering for climate resilience, if we don't have the policy mechanisms there, there's not much we can do. Treatment of uncertainty. This is a set of projections from UK climate change projections 2018. What's there isn't particularly of importance for what we want to talk about here, but it's basically showing that there's a range of different projections, in this case for winter precipitation in the 2080s. The uncertainty itself isn't the problem, it is how we use it, whether we can embrace it in a way and use it in a consistent way across the planning hierarchy. So we have we're developing plans and policies at national level, strategic level, project level, and right down to local level. And if we're not thinking about climate change uncertainty in the same way throughout that system, then we're not going to get to consistent the results that we want. There are in some areas like national policy statements, which are things that I work very closely with. You have very specific guidance around the use of uncertainty. And in other areas, that's just not the case, and the lack of detail in terms of how to consider the fact that we just don't know what the future is going to look like can be problematic. There are solutions. I'm going to bring one up in a bit, and I know that this is something that Nick's going to be very interested in talking to you about as well. Right, in terms of skill sets and complexity, this is one of the main things I want to get across. So at one level, at a very high, at a very kind of macro level, this is showing us how everything's interconnected at like a national infrastructure assessment level. The energy systems are connected to telecoms and to water and to transport. Everything's very complicated, and you find that you have very, very detailed, quantified models that try to understand how these systems interact and what climate change would mean to them. Now, that's at highly quantitative, highly analytical. Coming down a level at the major project level, very highly regulated. You have climate risk assessments. You're able to do a often semi-quantitative risk assessment. And what this really comes down to is the skills you need are actually working with engineers and with environmental specialists. So this is going to be, right, okay, how high does this bridge need to be? How much clearance do we need for flood risk? What are the temperatures we need to consider for this combined heat and power system? How large, what do we expect for the migratory patterns to be changed for an ecosystem, and how do we deal with that? So it's more those kind of design decisions and commitments at that level. And then right at the very end, this is kind of the thing that Isabella was talking about at a town planning level. You have completely qualitative things like green roofs, green infrastructure. There won't be any complexity to the assessment that goes into this. The London plan's excellent. It's bringing in things around urban greening factors and things like that. But basically, this is just good design. It's putting things in place that are that reduce risk of flooding, that have health benefits, that reduce the urban heat island effect. You wouldn't want the same person designing your green roof as you were doing that very complicated system to understand the national infrastructure, and vice versa. So there's a huge range of skill sets and complexity needed, and there isn't any one person in the country that fits the bill. So it's kind of up to everybody to be able to integrate climate resilience into their work. And that's what we try to do here at Wood. Finally, the last challenge I want to bring up doesn't need me to tell you that we need to put roofs over people's heads. And there's lots of other mega trends other than climate change that need to be considered in the way that we plan and build things. Climate change is only one mega trend. Urbanization, aging population, people wanting to live by the sea is often quite challenging when you're talking about sea level rise. Digitalization, innovation, all these things are coming into it, and so we can't focus everything around climate resilience, but again, it needs to be integrated into every planning level. Right, some solutions. Process. This is our approach to having a kind of standardized system in which we work with clients at any level, so scalable from a kind of national level, international level, right down to a particular planning project, to go through a process of understanding that risk, assessing it, appraising what the options are, developing a plan, and then monitoring and reporting it. You can see that it's cyclical. You don't do an assessment for climate resilience and put it on the shelf. You need to continually look at how it's transforming, what your key indicators and metrics are. So we're going over a certain level of flood risk or of some temperature threshold, for example, and continually analysing that and understanding what you can do about it. The risk assessment, identify options and appraisal options in purple. There's another process where there's standardised processes for continually learning and trying to understand more about your system to make sure that those options that you end up with are the best they can be. This is option assessment. So this is our tool that we have in-house at Wood, which is called Smart Deck. It is talking at that kind of decision-making point of view. This enables a client to choose what's important to them, the key metrics, be they to do with environment, costs, social benefits, to be able to put in all of their potential options, the portfolio of things you could do to build climate resilience, and then to be able to weight things and use technical approaches to decision making to be able to come up with those optimum answers. So it's dynamic, it moves around, you can see that the changes you're making are having different effects. And then adaptation pathways is another one. This points to the uncertainty piece. We don't know what the future is going to be, so let's stop pretending that we have a definite idea of what we need to do to have the benefit, the economic, social and environmental benefits in, say, 2080, 2090. We don't know. So let's make sure that we build things that are flexible, that are adaptable, and we put in place plans which enable us to take an option up if we cross some threshold. So these actions, A, B, C, and D, they may be entirely different. One of them might be something like coastal retreat, one of them might be build a bigger wall, one of them might be employ more green infrastructure in certain places. What we can say is that we're planning out how we might adapt in the future rather than trying to do everything now, because we don't want to maladapt. We don't want to say that, putting things in place that basically waste a load of money. For those of you in London, the Thames Estuary 2100 plan is the kind of starting point of this way of thinking, and it's fantastic. And so go and look at that if you have an opportunity to. It also looks a bit like the London Tube map, which is always a bonus. Right. some projects. Got a few minutes to run through some projects. What I'm going to do is start at a very macro, high level, that very complex quantitative side, and then bring it down to the kind of what your day-to-day as town planners might look like for those of you that are. This is a Southeast Europe transport resilience project with the World Bank. What we're doing here is a highly quantitative assessment of climate risk on different parts of the road network, setting all that out in a GIS platform and delivering then the best approaches for how to manage the climate risks across that road network in Albania, Croatia, Montenegro, those kind of areas. This obviously is a huge amount of computational expense and detailed decision-making techniques to get to produce the planning policy. It's not directed by the planning policy, but crucially, it's all about having those robust decisions that can be defended. At the next level, Florida Keys over in America now, sea level rise. I want to bring this one up because, you know, we're talking about very distant futures here. We need to show the right options because in that area there's sea level rises, meaning people are being driven out of their houses. We're going to lose land, and we need to provide evidence that back up those difficult decisions. And those difficult decisions at a political level are obviously quite challenging to make, and people get very, people rightfully get very concerned and about that. So we need to make sure that the optioneering that we're choosing is spot on in that case. Coming down a bit more, obviously maybe a little bit controversial. In terms of Heathrow Airport, we're not talking about whether we should be expanding the airport in terms of carbon here. What we're talking about is the airport as a microcosm of the city, basically. It's fantastically complicated. This is something that we've been working on at a project level. If you think about all of the different design, the highly regulatory environment, the incredible, like the energy systems, the amount of buildings that are there that are all different, have different services, the sustainable infrastructure that needs to be in place. All of these things need to be taken into account to come to engineering decisions as to how to make sure that that piece of infrastructure is resilient as possible to climate change. And it uses that adaptation plan development approach that I showed you before. We're now coming down into the area that might look more commonplace in your work. Master plan level, we're getting less and less quantitative now. This is over in Jacksonville in Florida. We'll be helping to open out a covered drainage system into the river there, completely opening it up with a restoration plan. So this is for flood alleviation, but think of all the social and environmental co-benefits that go with it. These are the kind of things that Isabella was talking about. There's community part in there, there's recreation, there's all sorts, but it's all qualitative. This is all just good design. So we've moved away from that point earlier on where we're talking about that highly robust quantitative assessment approach. And then finally, right down to the level of the town planning, this is just taking good practice from policy. So this is totally qualitative. It's putting in place cycling and walking. It's putting in place sustainable drainage, community woodlands for health benefits, and reducing heat islands, soft edges. Entirely qualitative, but what I want to get across is just as effective and just as important, just at a different place in the policy, in the planning regime. So I think about done. Final thoughts then. Futures. So we're changing rapidly, and planning needs to work with that. It's only one of a range of megatrends that are changing society. It's cross-cutting across the whole planning hierarchy. Good practice looks very different depending on your context, and there are the processes and tools that are available. As I said, my name is Chris Harris. Do get in touch with me if you want to discuss any of this. We've got a Q&A session at the end, but you can also find me on LinkedIn, and do feel free to ask me any questions. Nick's gonna take you through some of the more detail and some of those solutions. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to see some real life projects there, and at different scales as well, and how climate change resilience can be implemented across the board, really. It's also interesting to hear what you say that around flexibility and the need for that, and I think that's really important at the whole project life cycle, really. Things change, like you say, we don't know the future. Let's not pretend to know it at all at the moment, even more so in 50, 60 years time. Thank you. Okay, I would like to introduce our final speaker for today, Nick Pyatt. Nick is a development specialist and leadership coach. He works for Trios, who specialise in organisational capacity assessments of climate change risk and adaptation. He is part of a working group to develop a new British standard on adaptation pathways, planning, and an approach for managing climate uncertainty. So I'm sure we're all interested in what he has to say today. Over to you, Nick. Nick, I think you might still be on mute.
Thanks very much. Apologies for that. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to take you through some elements of experience and approaches in a little bit more detail, addressing some of the things that Chris has mentioned. And the approach that we take in the work that we do, which is looking at organisational capability elements of managing climate risk, is about being climate smart, making the right decision at the right time and reducing the costs of acting either too early or too late. So the first step is right-sizing your effort. And we don't want to oversimplify our responses. We don't want to overcomplicate things. If we overcomplicate, we become inefficient. If we undercomplicate, oversimplify, we become unsuccessful. So here's a rule of thumb. If you have decisions which are climate vulnerable but are straightforward to reverse or renew in the next 10 years, then probably a generalist, a non-climate specialist will be able to come up with solutions which are pretty clear. If you have climate vulnerable decisions to make which are going to last between 10 and 20 years before it's convenient to change or reverse the decision, then you probably need some expert support and input into that, but you're probably going to come up with a pretty clear idea of what the right solution is. Once we go beyond 20 years, the uncertainty that Chris was talking about in terms of the pace and nature of climate change that's likely to unfold beyond that means that there's a level of uncertainty which means that we can't know at this stage quite what the levels of the types of vulnerability are going to be. And so in our decision making today, we need to manage that uncertainty. And that takes a different level of skill. And so that's a useful rule of thumb in terms of working out how to right-size the level of effort you put into working out what climate vulnerabilities are and how to effectively respond. Another element is that climate risk is often systemic. So this is a mind map related to urban heat vulnerabilities, for instance, developed by the Dutch. It's a whole range related to health, the changes in the way we use and the opportunities within outdoor spaces, quality of life in terms of productivity, both indoors and outdoors comfort, retail and value chains, the impact on those, schools and childcare, water use and demand, infrastructure, how that works, its viability as the pressures on it change and the impact on the system. So we need to think systemically if we're going to think resilient. And uncertainty, another thing that Chris talked about. And this is an area that development planners, town planners, district planners we talk to sometimes find a little bit challenging to move beyond the regulatory frameworks within which they normally work. So we're taking an example here of river flow and flood. So look at this level of uncertainty. This is for the southeast here. These are the different levels of projection. Well, a sort of a central level projection that's sort of most likely, if you like, is that by the 2020, sort of around now in the near future, we're going to get 10% increase above the what the historical flood level, river flow levels would be. By the 2050s, 20%. By the 2080s, 35%. But following that projection is a bit like saying I'm happy with a 50% chance that my car is going to get me to where I want to go. And I've had cars like that, and frankly, I don't want to go back there. So it's really useful and good practice to have plans for significantly higher scenarios, so that even if we don't need to use the plan, we know what we would need to do if we move towards those higher scenarios. And so we're going to dig a little bit down into that in terms of how it reflects on the way that current planning invites us to think. And we're going to think about the idea of a 30% increase in river flow. So that's slightly less than the central projection for the 2080s and for the higher central projection about what we would expect in the 2050s. And this is a real case. So a 1 in 100 return period on this particular river, the River Parrett in Somerset, at this point on the river, 1 in 100 a year return period for this river under the current climate is that, about 8.5 meters. If we have a 30% increase in peak river flow because of climate change, a 100 return period peak river level is over 9 meters. But what does that mean for, how does that compare to current return rate? Well, you have to be looking at a 1 in 1,000 year return period to be managing, to be resilient to a future 1 in 100 return period. You're making a lot of decisions which are going to be around for the next 60 years or more. And so when I have a conversation with a district planner who says, I'm fine because the designs I'm making are resilient for the next 100 years because we are making it resilient to a 1 in 100 return period, as you can see, that isn't a useful way of interpreting current climate or the resilience of the current return rates. Happy to ask questions on any more questions on that later. Adaptation pathways. This again is something that Chris touched upon. And this is a really great way of developing plans for those uncertain climate futures, but also being able to be climate smart. You only develop your resilience at the pace and scale at which the climate is requiring you to do so. This is for London. This is about water supply. Some of you may have seen this. Now, 0 here on this axis is the point at which, at the point the plan was developed, the current water system was able to meet the needs of London. Each number here, as we go towards the right, is the level of deficit, of water deficit, megalitres per day, if climate change carries on. And these below the line are a series of responses. So the first thing to do would be to start sorting out leakage schemes, then look at targeted compulsory metering, and that will take us to managing about 275 megalitres per day beyond what the current system would provide. At that point, we start needing to do some big engineering. But we've got choices. We've identified some choices here. We've got a big reservoir at Albingdon, or we've got pumping water out of the Severn estuary, or a smaller Albingdon reservoir, and there's a whole series of options here. And another element of the value of this sort of approach is that if you know what the future is, you can work out what sort of lead time we might need to be able to take some future action. So when you start to approach the lead time for a next action, potentially that time for next action, you can decide, do we need to start making that decision yet? But you don't need to start making that decision until you're coming into that zone. Now, above the line, we have different climate scenarios. And the thick bars here are the range in which this scenario is most likely to occur. And so 2020 medium scenario, around now, probably a leakage scheme is probably enough. When we're looking towards the 2050s, the low case climate change projections mean that probably targeted compulsory metering is probably still enough. Once we get to the medium case scenario, we start to be needing this big engineering. And because we can start to spot that, we're ready and we're not going to be caught out, and we can be ready in time. And what's happening now is that Thames Water and Ofwat are already having discussions about which of these, the Abington Reservoir or the pumping from the Thames, the Severn Estuary into the Thames, are the option to take. And so this allows longer term planning. Here's another example, but when you're talking about town planning, then you've got multiple facets. And this is, I'm not going to go into any detail on this, I'll burrow down into a little bit of in a moment, but you can start to build these quite complicated adaptation pathways plans to help you work out what you need to be doing now, what could wait till later, what the lead times are. And here's an example of some of the things that were in there that gave us some certainty, because we started to realize that some elements of these were already quite resilient. So let me, I beg your pardon, I'm going to go back to that. Okay, so we had electricity distribution. Sound as though the electricity distribution people had a pretty good plan. Up to 3 meters of flooding, they were fine. If they get to that, they just move all the substations 5 meters into the air and put bigger defences around the main stations. The biggest problem for them, however, is planning, because some of their substations that they want to put out of the way of the water are in attractive areas, and people don't want a big substation stuck high up in the air. And so in some of the most vulnerable areas, which are also the prettiest, they become least resilient if we carry on with current planning priorities. We've got things looking here at different options for the motorways. So the current system is fine. There is a stretch of the M5 motorway in this particular area that is already getting quite vulnerable to peak river flows. They have an interim plan. When that becomes, when peak river flows get high enough so that flooding is the new normal, they've got a point at which they know how to reroute. And there's a whole series of these forward planning, identifying these plans, knowing what the triggers might be so that you're in control of your adaptation. And also there's a reassurance that you know how to get to these high case scenarios, even if you don't need to. And there's a level of confidence and capability that you can build around having that understanding. So Chris also was talking about the level of engagement with climate adaptation and the differences around the world or around the country. Now, this is I'm going to introduce a set of metrics into which you can understand the capability of an organization, in this case, cities and organizations like yourselves, understand the strengths and weaknesses in being able to address their climate adaptation challenges. And what you don't worry about the detail, as each city has a bar chart showing strengths and weaknesses, and just look at how level the variability is. A huge range of variability, as you can see. So again, being climate smart, if we're wanting to develop our adaptive capacity, there's no point in banging away the things that we're already good at. Understanding what's holding us back is really important. And this particular set of metrics helps us to understand what we're good at, what's holding us back, and the most efficient way of using our scarce resources to move from where we need to be to where we are, which is this current profile. And on these graphs, you'll see a red line, which is where the assessment says these are the levels of adaptive capacity we need. We might want to go beyond that, but that's probably enough to manage your particular climate vulnerabilities. This is a reiteration of the same graph and this is an amalgamation, average adaptive capacities of 12 UK infrastructure management companies. We've done this in dozens of different infrastructure management operators, but I'm going to highlight a very common feature of adaptive capacity in almost any organization. If you look at these different pathways, these strengths, typically awareness and agency, which is the ability to spot a problem and know what to do about it, and the availability of evidence and expertise, probably the encouragement of champions, are relatively high compared to everything else. And what this can be a little bit misleading within our culture, because with awareness, agency, evidence and expertise, and people wanting to make changes, you can have a great conversation and even convince yourself that you're really good at this stuff. Pretty commonly, the lagging pathways, the stuff that's holding you back, is that this awareness isn't being transferred into managing operations. There's a lag between what we know how to do and what we're actually doing. And picking up these barriers to turning what we know into operations is crucial to building our capacity to manage our climate vulnerability. And just to give you an idea of explore this a little bit further, we sometimes come across reports which say, with adaptation, we can make this level of saving. Well, our experience is that it isn't that simple. This pyramid here is the maturity index, the different levels of capacity that we might be able to pick up through doing the sort of metrics we talked about before. I'm going to compare it against a piece of work that the insurance sector have done, which says that by the 2050s, we can expect, without effective, significantly higher levels of climate adaptation, a 60% increase in losses on properties over current flooding losses. But if we adapt fully in an ideal way, those losses will be reduced to 20%. But adaptation isn't a thing you switch on or off. There's levels of it. We need to learn how to do things a bit at a time better. And so if you take this 6-point scale, you can see that rather than being a jump from a choice between 20% or 60% of losses, each level of adaptive capacity adds value and reduces the level of losses. So the amount of effort we put into our organizational barriers is fundamental to our ability to turn the great technical analysis that you can do to know what to do into practice. And finally, I'd like to point out that, or bring to your attention, that last year the first ISO standard in climate adaptation was produced. And we've looked at this, we understand it pretty well, and it's a really good framework for working out what we need to pay attention to and guiding us to working from the adaptive capacity we have at the moment to the levels of adaptive capacity and the actions to effectively address the vulnerabilities that we have. Thanks again. If anybody is interested to explore this or wants to talk about any of this, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. That's great. I think we've got about 10 minutes left for questions, so I know I could talk about this for ages, but let's try and get on to some of the questions we've had raised. I think we've got over 300 people on the webinar, so there has been quite a few, so we'll try and get through as many as we can, but if not, we'll try and get back to you offline where we can. So this is a question to everybody really, I guess. At a national level, do we feel we're currently on course to meet the challenges of climate change?
Yeah, I can just quickly do that. I would say that there are lots of positives actually, and Nick might well want to comment on this, but I think we do see a lot of good practice. There's a lot of things that Nick's brought up there that show that it is inconsistent, but the policy is really good, is in place. We're gradually seeing it better, going through that hierarchy that I talked about. But there are areas to improve. Some of the areas that we aren't that good at yet are things like interdependencies between different systems, so understanding cascade effects and knock-on impacts, and also multiple hazards. People tend to think about, right, it's going to flood or it's going to be too hot, but they don't really think about how those hazards come together and can affect at the same time. The next climate change risk assessment is going to cover that, and that's going to be coming out in 2022. There's been a lot of work going into that, and then the next national adaptation plan is going to try and push that forward. So there's a gap there that's being filled.
Cool. Do you have anything to add, Nick?
I think I would largely support what Chris is saying. There's some really good practice, and the UK is world leading in some of that practice, and there are gaps. And I think that planning and is an area where there is currently a wide range of capability and huge opportunities, because so much of the resilience is going to be delivered through town planning. And so it's great to see such a level of interest in this area and this webinar.
Yeah, great. That actually leads quite nicely onto our first poll. So you should be, Lucy, if you're ready to launch it, you should see a poll on your screens now. We're just asking you as viewers whether you think the current national planning policy is fit for purpose to meet the challenges of climate change. You should just be able to hover over the answer and click it. And if I give you a couple of seconds, we should start to get some answers in. Okay, Lucy, have we started to get people responding? Okay, interesting. I don't know if any of the panelists have any views on the answers there, but it's 50% of the viewers no.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I would say I do probably agree with that, and there are definitely gaps at a national level in planning policy, and also a lack of clarity over things. For example, the standards for low carbon homes at the moment. I think there was something introduced in 2016 and it was then retracted. And yeah, there is definitely uncertainty, and at the RTPI we are looking at the national planning policy framework and trying to understand what can be improved.
Yeah, I concur. I would have expected that to be the case. I mean, it's never going to be perfect, but and there are areas where it's really good. But I mean, housing is a great example that, you know, we're not building houses that are fit for the future across the country. That's pretty obvious. I think a lot of people know that, and a lot of town developments aren't necessarily, you know, ready for the challenges of the future. National policy isn't obviously the only thing that is going to change that. It needs to go down through the hierarchy, as we talked about. But we should always strive to be improving it and trying to get better. Obviously, there's huge political dimensions to do with this that could be another webinar in its own right. But
yes, great. Okay, we have a question from the audience. How does planning for climate resilience fit with viability considerations, particularly in areas where land values are not especially high? Has anyone got any thoughts on that?
Just a thought on that is that those land areas that are not particularly high may become, depending on what their vulnerabilities are, they could either be increased in their value through adaptation over the long term because you reduce their vulnerability, or they could go, maybe one of the reasons for their low value is their vulnerability, and by addressing it, those areas become less vulnerable. And I'm just wondering whether there is also a connection between land value and climate justice. Because those low land value places will attract the places that people with least opportunity are drawn to, and not paying attention to those could potentially make that situation significantly worse.
Yeah, definitely. And that was, I guess, coming back to what I briefly touched on in my presentation about the importance of resourcing local authorities to deal with this, and climate justice, and seeing where that vulnerability intersects, and ensuring that those communities do have the correct funding. If they're not going to get the funding from the kind of private market or housing sector or development in the area, it does need to come from elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. I think might just say, sort of also in response, sort of picking up on some of the last points and the value of national regulation. I think sometimes planners and local authorities are put in a pretty difficult situation from developers, because the cost of adaptation, effective adaptation, can be seen by the developers as a lost profit, and a massive amount of pressure put on not to put adaptation requirements on, and the lower the value of the land, the greater that pressure can be. And that can be, and at the moment, the accounts I get is that it's, with current national regulations, it's difficult to uphold the sort of things that some people would like to do, and developer planners would like to see happen as a national regulation. So in those 10 situations, I think there is a particular value of those regulatory requirements being reinforced. And going back to the point I made, if people are being compliant and think they're doing the right thing with a 1 in 100 return rate protection, and yet over the life of that development they need to be actually starting at 1 in 1,000, they're not necessarily supported by regulation.
Thanks. So I'm just conscious of time. We do have to finish at 1:30, but we've probably got time to run the second poll, if you can, Lucy, just to get a response on that. So we're asking you whether budgets should be primarily directed at climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, or both equally. And hopefully we're starting to get some answers to come through. I'll give you a couple more seconds if you haven't made up your mind. Okay, hopefully we've got some responses.
Yeah, so okay. So I mean, it's a black and white question to a very sort of grayscale issue. Obviously we need to be doing both. It's just interesting to, you'd expect mitigation, I suppose, to come up a bit more. I suppose the question this leads itself to is about how integrated those two are. We haven't I haven't talked as much about energy systems and decentralized energy and all that kind of thing, but it is just worth making that fairly obvious point that actually, mitigating for climate change, reducing our impacts on climate change, goes hand in hand with the way in which we're making more resilient spaces and societies.
Okay, we've got about a minute left. We have had a lot of questions, so apologies if we haven't got to yours yet. Just one last one to end on, perhaps, is whether the panel sees COVID-19 as a game changer for the climate policy UK-wide. Let's try and end on a positive as well.
Well, I mean, one example, I guess, is active travel and all the kind of huge investments that governments have announced in active travel, and the increase that people are walking and cycling more. So I guess that would be a positive game changer. But on the flip side of that, the car is kind of increasingly being seen as a safe mode of travel, and that might pose some challenges for planners in terms of being able to introduce congestion charging and things like that just directly after kind of COVID. So I mean, I think it is a game changer in terms of it has really shown the kind of level of change that we need to make, but there is also the risk of regression.
Yeah. I totally agree. 3 really quick things. It's an amazing opportunity. The second one is kind of showing that actually quite a lot of where our systems are resilient already, because there's been a lot of change in the way we're doing it. And thirdly, have a look at how many climate change risk assessments in the last round have pandemics and changes to pests and diseases and that on their watching brief, rather than actually having things for trying to understand what climate change means for those. I think that's going to change from now, because it's clearly environmental degradation and changes to migratory patterns, which is going to make those issues worse.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's probably all we've got time for today. To just remind everyone that the session has been recorded, so you will get sent a link in the next few days. I know we've had a lot of questions. We'll try and see if we can take any of those offline and get back to you. But I just want to thank you all for listening and to thank the speakers. I know we can't all thank you in the traditional way, but on behalf of the RTPI London, and I'm sure all of our many listeners, thank you for today. It's been very insightful, and look forward to hearing more about climate change over the next few months, and hopefully it doesn't fall off the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you.